In this issue, we will discuss a work called 1984, the masterpiece and last book by George Orwell, real name Eric Arthur Blair, a writer who was born in British colonial India, was a policeman in Burma, and later a wandering journalist in Paris and London. Although it is a dystopian novel set in the near future, 36 years after 1948 when he wrote it, his satirical style as a reportage writer, in which he bitterly criticized totalitarianism through his experience of serving in the Burmese police, which was a part of imperialism, and participating in the Spanish Civil War, had a great influence on later society. His satirical style, which was scathingly critical of totalitarianism, had a profound impact on society in later years. In today's society, where the internet has become the mainstream media, the polarization of information, in which we are constantly imprinted with the aggressive support of the majority, poses a more serious challenge to us than fiction. There are four main characters. Winston Smith, who is involved in falsifying news reports at the Central Ministry and questions the current system. Julia, who poses as an active member of the ministry's Abstinence League and desires a life of pleasure. O'Brien is a high-ranking bureaucrat with a knack for manipulating people's minds and a deftness in exploiting their self-contradictions. And Mr. Charrington, an elderly man who runs a thrift store in the favelas under the guise of his attachment to a bygone era. Winston, the protagonist, is at the mercy of plausible facts to escape the suffocation of a society that pursues convenience. In the darkness of his solitude, away from the light of day, he opens an old-fashioned diary and writes aimlessly about his unfulfilled thoughts. In the near future, 36 years later, the nations of the world have been consolidated into three superpowers after a struggle, with each dictatorship: Oceania in the British cultural sphere, East Asia in the former Japanese and Chinese regions, and Eurasia in the former European and Russian regions, in a state of constant war in the neutral zone with changing combinations of allies and enemies. The story takes place in one of the major cities of Oceania, a one-party dictatorship to which the former London belongs. In reality, a very small group of elites known as the Party Bureau is in charge of the center of the government, seizing power and controlling and monitoring the people. The majority of the people are the working class, known as the proles, who live in extreme poverty but are harmless people who follow the system and stop thinking because of the incendiary entertainment provided by the party. In the middle class are the ordinary party members, known as the party outsiders, who are subjected to strict surveillance and meager rations from the authorities and forced to work to maintain the party's power in the four central ministries that govern the people: the Ministry of Truth, the Information Operations Agency, the Ministry of Peace, which controls the military, the Ministry of Plenty, which handles chronic economic problems, and the Ministry of Love, which monitors each citizen through its police power. Winston Smith, who works in the Records Bureau of the Ministry of Truth, works in a partitioned room in a huge pyramid-shaped building, falsifying and destroying by voice input, as directed, past information about the press, education, entertainment, and the arts that has become inconvenient to the party. Every minute of every day, the past is rewritten to match the present, and in no case, without exception, is the record ever allowed to remain inconsistent. One skillful method the state uses to control its people is a special way of thinking called doublethink, in which it makes people admit new facts even if they know they are lies, makes them forget that they were even lies, and makes them accept the exact opposite facts as facts, thus depriving them of the ability to think. There was also a party push to remove from standard English the rich vocabulary that was not appropriate for this surveillance society and replace it with a simplified official language called Newspeak, a mechanical listing of numbers and nouns. Winston was sometimes given the task of correcting editorials in the Daily Times to Newspeak. Also, each morning near 11 a.m., station employees would be forced to stop work and gather in the hall to participate in a program called 2-Minute Hate. In this program, Emmanuel Goldstein, the ringleader of the revolutionary movement, is shown on a giant telescreen and curses for 2 minutes. It is said that Goldstein, an underground leader who was one of the former party leaders along with Big Brother, has dedicated himself to overthrowing the state and calling himself Brothers Alliance, in revolt against Big Brother's dictatorship, and that he has been sentenced to death but mysteriously still disappears and hides somewhere to incite resistance. And spies and agents working for revolution under his instructions are being uncovered daily by the thought police. Huge posters throughout the city, holding up "Big Brother is watching you." In the squares, in government offices, and under surveillance that is constantly transmitted and received by a device called a telescreen installed in every household of party members, an individual's record is immediately erased from society if he or she defies doublethink and is considered a thought criminal. As the audience's hatred reaches a fever pitch, overlapping Goldstein's images of the March of Eurasian armies, now considered enemies, on a giant telescreen, Winston begins to observe two contrasting figures: Julia, the abusive female station agent, and O'Brien, the taciturn man in black uniform who represents the party's central committee. As he grows increasingly disgusted with young Julia, who wears a red sash, the symbol of the Abstinence League, around her work clothes, as if she were a pawn of the thought police, Winston realizes that O'Brien, who smells like him, is the voice that spoke to him in a dream 7 years ago, telling him to meet me where darkness does not exist. Since then, they have come to believe that O'Brien is the one person with whom they would like to have an honest conversation alone, if only they were not being watched. Eventually, the station staff's hatred reached a peak, and when Big Brother, the leader of Oceania, with his party slogans, "War is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is power," appeared on the screen, the station staff held up their hands, "My savior," and pray, then hold out their hands, "Big Brother," and continue to chant repeatedly. Winston, who had joined in the frenzy like everyone else, inadvertently let his true feelings of antipathy, which he had forgotten to hide, show on his face. At that moment, Winston senses a message from O'Brien, whose eyes have met his. "I know exactly what you're feeling right now," he said. "But don't worry. I'm on your side. Maybe the rumors of underground forces are true and the revolutionary organization is real." For Winston, who lives under surveillance in a confined world, those few seconds with O'Brien were unforgettable and inspired an unexplainable sense of hope. In a room of a dilapidated apartment, Winston hides behind the blind spot of a wall-mounted telescreen and writes his thoughts with a notebook and pen, a writing instrument that is now obsolete. He even commits a thought crime, writing in his diary for what? He cannot clearly recall his mother's face or his childhood memories. It may be true that life is better today than it was before the dictatorship. But if there is any hope for the instinctive feeling that life is unbearable now, it is for those working-class people who have no social vision and are let loose by the party like animals. He found himself standing in front of a familiar antique shop where he had bought the diary. Charrington, the quiet, gray-haired old owner, said, "There's a little furniture and antiques upstairs," and invited Winston into the small, crowded store, leading him to a room that appeared to be still occupied. Surprisingly, there is no telescreen in the room. Instead, a painting of the church that was there before the bombing is framed and fixed to the wall. Listening to Mr. Charrington crooning Mother Goosey's "Oranges and Lemons," Winston leaves the thrift store with a sense of nostalgia he cannot recall. But on the dimly lit pavement outside the store, he bumps into Julia, that female bureau worker in the same work clothes from the ministry, and witnesses her look directly at Winston as she quickly leaves. Winston opened his diary and imagined what would happen to him when he was taken away by the thought police. "I'm sure I'll meet O'Brien where there is no darkness. War is peace. Freedom is servitude. Ignorance is power." A few days later, Winston left the partition room while on duty, and Julia fell down in the hallway as he passed her. Despite the fact that she is an enemy trying to trap him, a strange feeling arises and he unexpectedly helps her up. She quickly slips a folded note into Winston's hand and leaves as if nothing had happened. Winston, while performing his duties, unfolds the note in the palm of his hand in a position hidden from telescreen and sees that it reads, "I like you," and he goes about his tedious paperwork, trying not to let telescreen know of his emotional turmoil. 10 days later, he finally sits across from Julia in the cafeteria at lunchtime, and over a meal, he arranges to meet her in the square after work in a muffled voice. After work, Winston arrives at the crowded square and meets Julia, who has approached him in the chaos of the Eurasian prisoners of war being escorted out and accusations flying around, at the end of a more complicated route. Winston asked, "You are not a member of the Abstinence League?" Julia threw down the red sash wrapped around her work clothes and said, "I knew right away you didn't fit in with the party. I just want to enjoy being alive more. I've done this dozens of times before," she said, and took off her work clothes. Winston, who felt the imposing nobility of Julia, who revealed these animal instincts that have the power to resist the party and neutralize this totalitarian society, takes her hand in the grass, embraces her, and becomes physical with her. Their orgasms were like political acts unleashed against the party. Winston, taking the risk of finding a place to make love under surveillance, rents a vacant, telescreen-free room on the second floor of an antique store that Mr. Charrington had previously shown him and meets secretly with Julia. Mr. Charrington, in need of rental income, graciously rented the room to Winston and helped keep their secret by closing the store so that no one could see them when they met upstairs. One day, lying on the bed in the room he rented at a thrift store, Winston was startled to see a mouse crawling out of a hole in the paneling, and for some reason he shuddered. When Julia soothed him with concern, Winston said. He told her, "Perhaps it is best that you go home quietly and say goodbye forever before it is too late. This good fortune will not last forever. You are still young. If you don't associate with people like me, you will live another 50 years. If I am arrested, if I confess, you will be shot. The reverse is also true. If I am tortured and my love for you disappears, it is a betrayal to you." But Julia said, "They can't do that. They can make us say things, but they can't make us believe them. They can't get inside our hearts." Winston is convinced by her strong words that if the future is not about survival but about maintaining our humanity, then even if the Ministry of Love tortures us and reveals the truth, they cannot manipulate our love for each other. Winston was walking down a long hallway in the ministry when he noticed a cough behind him, stopped and turned around, and was surprised to hear from O'Brien, walking up behind him, "I've been wanting to talk to you once. I read your Newspeak-related article in the Times the other day. I sensed a certain elegance in the way you wrote that article. If you are interested in the 10th edition of the Newspeak Dictionary, would you be willing to pick it up at my house at your convenience?" Winston, who immediately understood the direction of the conversation, watched O'Brien's back as he walked away, suppressing the excitement of finally getting the clue he had hoped for when O'Brien himself hinted at the existence of a revolutionary organization. Winston and Julia visit O'Brien's mansion, and Winston, gathering his courage, is invited by a servant to sit in the luxurious study where O'Brien is organizing his papers. O'Brien, leisurely rising from his chair, turns off the telescreen as he walks over. Even I, at the center of the party, can't keep the telescreen off for more than half an hour. "Comrade, let me hear your side of the story first," he said, urging his opinion. Winston hesitated, then asked, "Are you involved with a secret organization that is plotting some revolutionary activity against the party? We are thought criminals, we are guilty of adultery, and we do not trust the state. Is Goldstein real?" O'Brien replies, "Yes, our leader Goldstein is alive. Are you ready to rebel against your country and give your life?" When they both say yes, O'Brien asks, "Are you also prepared to be separated?" Julia replies, "No." Winston nodded. O'Brien replied, "Good, you've answered my question well. Later, I will give you a book that describes our strategy for overthrowing the nature of this society. When you have finished reading it, you will be part of a secret organization. You have heard many rumors about the organization, but fighting against the thought police is no ordinary task. Do you have a place to hide? Winston explained the room he was renting in Mr. Charrington's store. O'Brien said, "That's fine for now. As soon as we get it, we'll deliver Goldstein's book to you," shook hands with them, and left Winston and the others. As they left the room, Winston saw through the doorway that O'Brien had already turned on the telescreen with a blank expression on his face and returned to his work. Winston, who works for the Ministry of Truth, an intelligence agency, is exhausted from working overtime every day when he receives a package from O'Brien and begins reading Goldstein's book, which he takes out of his briefcase in Mr. Charrington's rented room. While enjoying the blissful sensation of reading a forbidden book alone in a room without a telescreen, he becomes fascinated by the book's contents. Chapter 1: Ignorance is Power. Since time immemorial, humankind has been classified into a structure of upper, middle, and lower classes in terms of status ratings, and each of these three classes has very different aspirations. The goal of the upper class is to maintain the status quo, the goal of the middle class is to replace the upper class, and the goal of the lower class is to achieve an equal society. The upper group understands the basic principles of domination and practices an oligarchy that centralizes the symbols of power, territory, money, and information by means of propaganda, infiltration, surveillance, information control, and the abolition of private property through printing and communication technology, while Big Brother, the leader of a one-party dictatorship, maintains his power and the respect and fear of the people. In order to sustain the oligarchy, thorough guidance of the middle class is indispensable. The upper class fears the replacement of the hierarchy by superior malcontents emerging from the middle class. Their dissatisfaction with their lives is ventilated through 2 minutes hate and other means toward a virtual enemy, while their dissatisfaction with the system is forced to stop thinking through forced doublethink. The mission of the upper class is not to distribute wealth between the middle and lower classes, but to monitor the middle class and keep it ignorant. This is the principle by which the privileged class is able to rule permanently. Winston read the book to Julia as she lay in bed. Chapter 3: War is Peace. The world has been divided into three superpowers of even strength, working together with different combinations of allies and enemies, in a perpetual state of war for 25 years. The military power of the three nations has always been equal, never exercising aggression or conquest, following the objective of continuing war for peace, the purpose being to destroy and consume the products of each nation. Since the 19th century, industrialized societies have been faced with the problem of how to deal with the surplus of manufactured goods. When there is a surplus, there is no choice but to distribute it. Distribution creates wealth for the middle class and increases the number of knowledgeable people, but it is the upper class that suffers. As people learn and think for themselves, it will become obvious that the privileged class is incompetent, and those in the middle class who have knowledge will immediately start to destroy this social structure. This is why the upper class has always had the propensity to try to maintain the status quo. Modernization has come to the conclusion that the only way to avoid distribution over unstoppable production is to destroy the surplus product, and finally to repeat the destruction and production by means of war. In wartime, people become more receptive to surrendering their lives to those in power and to being controlled, and they become ignorant fanatics who accept eternal war. This is most evident in the party center, where the higher one's position in the party, the more one becomes a war hysteric, calmly grasping the war situation and enthusiastic about victory. All of this is the result of doublethink. What, by the way, is the ultimate purpose of power that so tramples on human dignity? What was the first step in such a grand scheme? What is the absolutely unquestionable instinct that created doublethink? Winston is surprised to find that what he had been thinking had been systematized in a book, and he becomes curious to know why the rulers try to maintain their power. A prole woman humming outside his window and hanging up his washed children's clothes, Winston thinks. I don't think I'll ever have children with Julia. In that sense, we may already be dead. But as long as we both hold to the belief that 2 plus 2 is 4, we will be able to leave living proof to the next generation that will live in the future. And he casually whispers to Julia, we are already dead, and she laughs and ruminates, we are already dead. Then a voice from the wall behind him says, yes, you are already dead, and the painting's frame falls to the floor, shattering the glass and exposing the hidden telescreen. Now you can see the whole thing. Stand in the center of the room, hands behind your head, back to back, the warning echoes through the room. You may want to say your goodbyes. Now the candles are lit, and it's time for bed. Here comes the candlelight. Come on, we'll chop your head off. With the words of the Mother Goose song, Winston is surrounded by men from the thought police who rush into the room. Behind Winston, his knees shaking and motionless as a rat, is Julia, who has been punched in the stomach and is writhing in pain on the floor. As Julia is carried away by the men, a cold-hearted man who appears to be their boss appears in front of Winston. He is a young, dark-haired Mr. Charrington, who has taken off his disguise. Winston, waiting on a bench with other criminals in a windowless white-tiled prison monitored by telescreens installed here and there, is surprised to see Parsons, a colleague from the same office, being taken away. What did you do? He asked, to which Parsons replied, thought crime. He continued, my daughter saw me saying in my sleep, get Big Brother, and ratted me out. Of course, I don't hold that against her one bit. After all, it proves that I raised her right. Winston was willing to take the case if he could save Julia from suffering many times over where she had suffered so badly. Eventually Parsons is transferred, and as the other prisoners continue to come and go, Winston is surprised to see O'Brien enter the room with the guards and unexpectedly stands up. Did they catch you too? O'Brien says in a calm tone, I was captured long ago. Winston is clubbed in the elbow by the guard at his side and falls. How many days or weeks has it been since his arrest? In front of O'Brien standing beside him and a man in white holding a syringe, Winston is pinned to a bed under strong lighting and repeatedly beaten, kicked, and threatened with torture by men in black uniforms if he is even slightly unsatisfied with his answers to their interrogations. O'Brien said, don't worry, I have been watching over you for 7 years and am taking you into my custody. The turning point has come for me to make you a man of impeccable character, he says, and pulls an instrumented lever. As Winston suffers the intense pain of the electroshock, O'Brien says, you're scared, aren't you? If you try to lie or excuse yourself in any way to me, you will immediately scream. Do you understand? O'Brien then warned, remember when you wrote in your diary that freedom is being able to say 2 plus 2 equals 4? He then holds out his hand with 4 fingers in front of Winston's eyes and asks, if the party said you had 5 fingers instead of 4, what would you say? Winston says, 4, the lever is pulled again. Winston cries and screams as the pain continues, never knowing when it will end. Any number of bottles you want, I will die if you keep this up. I really don't know how many. What treatment did you give Julia? O'Brien smiled and said, she betrayed you. Instantly, without cover-up, he replied, and the same torture was repeated daily, with a man in white waking Winston up by sticking a needle in his arm. Winston's sleep became shorter, but he was able to sleep in strong lighting, did not want to get out of his fixed bed, and became committed to the task of re-education that O'Brien advocated. Freedom is servitude, 2 plus 2 is 5. Julia, my dear Julia. O'Brien grabs Winston by the shoulders and says in a gentle tone, what do you really think of Big Brother? Winston replies, I hate it, to which O'Brien replies, good. It looks like we're in the final stages. Not only must we obey Big Brother, we must love him. Winston is taken to room 101, a deep-roofed room notorious among prisoners, where he sees 2 ferocious rats trapped in a wire mesh mask on a table. Please, no. O'Brien covers Winston's face with the mask and explains, when you press the lever, the threshold of the cage will be released and these hungry rats will leap at your face. Winston, panic-stricken, realizing that there is only one person in the world who can impose the punishment that is now being forced upon him, repeatedly yells like a madman, "Do it to her. I don't care what you do to Julia, not me. I don't care if you tear her face off, I don't care if you eat her up to the bone. Not me, do it to Julia." The rat mask was removed from his face, and Winston felt himself falling headlong into the deep, bottomless darkness, leaving the cold feel of the wire mesh on his cheeks. Winston sits in a corner seat of the cafe every day, watching the waiter pour a glass of gin as he comes in, listening to the telescreen set up in the cafe, waiting for the Ministry of Peace to send a bulletin on the war situation on the African front. He is now well paid and drinks gin like this until closing time, except twice a week when he goes to his dusty office in the Ministry of Truth to do a little work. Winston recalls Julia saying, "They can't even get into people's minds," and O'Brien saying, "What you're going through here will last forever." Winston once ran into Julia in the park after his release from prison. She had a long scar on her forehead and a bloodless face, and she said, "I betrayed you. Sometimes, when I was threatened beyond endurance, I said, 'Do it to someone else, not me.' But those were words of sincerity, trying to save myself. I don't care how much others suffer," she told him bluntly, and Winston said, "I betrayed you, too. I only care about myself and I can't feel the same way I did before. I will see you again," and immediately left her. Remembering this, Winston picked up his glass and felt tears in his eyes as the scent of gin hit his nose. Soon, the sound of trumpets blared from the telescreens, and in Newspeak, a massive operation, the enemy has suffered a crushing defeat, completely demoralized, all of Africa has been conquered, the greatest victory in human history, victory, victory. The voice rasped out the war report in an excited, rapid-fire voice. Winston immediately felt the urge to run over to the crowd outside and join in the cheers, and he looked up at the huge portrait of Big Brother on display in the cafe and shed a gin-scented tear. And Winston now loved Big Brother with all his heart. At the end of the book, an anonymous article titled "Principles of Newspeak" appeared as an appendix, again in Old Speak, or Standard English, which discussed the decline of the Newspeak language that emerged during the era of British socialism, known as Ingsoc, and how it failed to spread among the people, and how, 36 years later the paper suggests that the one-party dictatorship of 1984, which was in the near future, has already closed as a past history. The terrifying thing about 2 Minutes Hate was not that each of us had to play a part, but that we could not help but be one with everyone else. The ugly, heightened fear and vengeance, the desire to kill the enemy, to torture him, to shatter his face with the blacksmith's mallet, runs like an electric current through everyone who watches the screen, turning them, against their will, into a contorted, screaming maniac.